This is kind of an abbreviated run through this material introducing MAUI, because after all, I didn't really need to introduce it. You used it last term, right? But, maybe reflecting a little bit on the history. I'm not sure how much of that you had a chance to talk about before, but the Mono project is where it all came from. Actually, a bunch of Microsoft guys got together and started this Mono project many years ago, more than 20 years ago. It was basically an implementation of the .NET framework, not .NET Core, even before that, the .NET framework on Linux, right? It was all open source, designed to continue to be cross-platform and so on. But then out of that came Xamarin, right? Xamarin, they decided, well, we might as well try to monetize this, basically. So they formed a company. And by the way, a developer license costs you about $2,000 a year US to use Xamarin. And they first came out with the initial version, then they added Xamarin Forms, which simplified your life a fair bit, less platform-specific stuff and so on to do there. And quickly, just to compare the two, your first version of Xamarin, you'd have a shared logic base with C#, but on top of that, they called them the heads, right? You actually had to do all the UI development with the normal tools for Android or iOS and so on, and basically that sat on top of the shared code base underneath, right? So it was still a big learning curve because you had to know quite a bit about each platform and so on, activities and layouts for Android, storyboards for iOS and so on and so forth, right? Okay, then Xamarin Forms came along and they added that XAML layer sitting on top. That really cut down the amount of customization you had to do for each individual platform. And, quite often you could get away with virtually hardly any, a few on-platform notes in your code to say, hey, if I'm on Android, tweak this property a little bit this way and things like that, right? For the most part, that was often all you had to do. All right, so comparing, of course, we've done a fair bit of work with Microsoft's XAML that we use in UWP. Xamarin would be similar. Oh, sorry, kind of went by that too quick. But you'd have things like a stack layout instead of a stack panel, an entry instead of a text box and things like that, right? Because entry was more generic and would be implemented in different ways in different platforms. So they really made it cross-platform focused. That had a bunch of common elements and controls, predefined cells and so on, right? For data templates. And by the way, this was an earlier version. They added even more as time went on than ones you see on the slide here, right? Page controls, right? Master detail pages built in, navigation pages, and so on, right? So you had a lot of capability that you could use. But how did we get to MAUI? Just kind of reminding ourselves a little bit that Xamarin, that was all Xamarin we were talking about up to that point in time. And Microsoft bought Xamarin, bought the company, right? And, that's great. But Xamarin is now deprecated, right? It was replaced by MAUI, and MAUI is now completely open source. So there's no more fees anymore. It's free for all developers to use. And, you can pay money if you want for different support packages, but basically it's open source, right? Okay, so comparing the two, well, really, they do say this. Can I swear that I've witnessed it? No, but they do say it's more performant, MAUI, as opposed to Xamarin. It definitely has a simpler project structure, right? They rearranged things so it's much easier to find everything within the project structure. They used to be almost sort of like separate little projects all bundled together in the solution, an individual project for each platform you wanted to be able to deploy to and so on, right? Another big change is Xamarin was, to be honest with you, very much focused on mobile development, right? So MAUI, they've increased the support for desktop, right? Whether it's on an Apple desktop or Windows desktop, right? So, it's trying to be one ring to rule them all type of thing, right? Just before I finish here, I want to talk a little bit about Blazor. I'm going to throw it open to the huge class I have in attendance today. Has anyone done any work with Blazor? Feel free to unmute your microphone. You can be a part of the recording.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, all right.
If I did, it would have been by accident.
Fair enough. Okay. Well, Blazor, it's another interesting technology that Microsoft came out with. The idea was that we can do all of our normal web development that you would do with JavaScript, but use C# instead, right? But they designed it from the get-go to be very much component-based. So you could make reusable components and just plug them in, and making it much easier to maintain, manage your code, and so on and so forth. So it's really quite interesting because it supports two different approaches. There's complete server-side, Blazor server, right, runs on the server and interacts with the web page down on the client. But all the interaction is done through SignalR. Now, you may or may not have heard of SignalR before, but basically it's a high-speed direct digital connection, you might say, going through HTTP, right? So, you know, the changes are basically instantly sent back and forth between the client and the server. It's actually very, very performant. Even on a fairly slow internet connection, it still works very, very well. But that's not all. Blazor has this other approach. You can, as you create the project, you decide whether you want server or client side. But if you do client side, then it uses WebAssembly, right? Which is another open source plugin basically for browsers. Most browsers, virtually all browsers today support it, right? So it runs on WebAssembly, so it actually runs completely locally inside the browser. Now, obviously, you still often want to interact with stuff coming from a server, but client-side Blazor allows you to have an app, a full-fledged web app. As long as you don't need data from the web, it'll just run on the local machine without any connection to the internet at all, right? So it gives you that interesting option as well, right? And it does allow full-stack development, integrates seamlessly with the whole .NET ecosystem. So, you know, all the good stuff you've learned to do with C# carries right over. And, you know, virtually it almost does away with the need to know much JavaScript. Although, I'm going to be honest with you, you still need to know JavaScript. Sorry, that's the reality of life if you're going to be a successful developer in your career. But anyway, it's a great thing, Blazor. There was a lot of support at first. Some people are saying, well, you know what, I'm not totally convinced. But one of the things that I've seen come out of it that I think is really quite neat is you can create, when you probably even saw this already, that when you make a MAUI application, one of the choices for project type is a MAUI Blazor hybrid, right? So what it basically does is it combines, you know, all your multi-platform stuff you get from MAUI, and basically the integration of Blazor gives you a very powerful, unified way to do multi-platform, cross-platform development, right? So you can leverage all your Blazor work, all the components you might have built earlier, et cetera, can be embedded with inside your MAUI application. And you can reuse the Blazor code and so on and so forth. So it's really kind of a neat idea. And I think that actually it might be, of the different styles of MAUI, it might be one of the most interesting to spend some time on. So this PowerPoint, actually I've got to revise the version, but it will be up. It is up already. I'm going to put my revised version up there shortly, up in Brightspace. But I put a link to an introductory tutorial on .NET MAUI Blazor. So, you know, if you're going to pick anything to play around with in your spare time, which you have so much of as this term, you know, you might want to play around with this one. And actually, I plan on doing a demo of a web API client, just a really simple, basic one using MAUI Blazor hybrid. But anyway, that's basically the end of my little discussion. So that's hardly an in-depth discussion of everything to know about MAUI or MAUI Blazor or anything else, but I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about a couple of those things and remind you, as I say here, this is a picture of a mug sitting on my shelf in my office, so everything I say will be on the exam. So good thing you listened today, right? Nah, I'm just kidding. Okay. All right. So bear with me. I'm just going to get Visual Studio up here. Any questions before I go on? Well, I might just stop and start the recording. Break it up a little bit.